My name is Dave Kurns, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Successful Farming magazine. You may not know this, but Successful Farming is another brand in the Meredith portfolio, and actually was the very first publication that Meredith published way back in 1902. So Successful Farming is a really extensive brand that serves farmers and production agriculture, primarily corn, soybean, wheat, and livestock producers across the country. We cover news, trends, and farm practices that make farmers successful. We publish the magazine monthly to 400,000 subscribers and nonstop on our website, agriculture.com, which, by the way, was also the first website at Meredith. Needless to say, when Jessie was looking for a moderator for a panel on sustainable food production, she knew she had a friend right here in the Meredith family. So with me today are four experts representing the fields of agriculture and academia. Together we'll be touching on precision ag technology, gene editing, vertical farming, regenerative practices, and other innovations that are helping growers be more productive, use fewer natural resources, sequester carbon, reduce waste, and improve soil health. All things that farmers are interested in. So let me introduce. Closest to me is Jason Rowntree, who is an associate professor of animal science at Michigan State University, where he addresses economic, environmental, and social complexity in agriculture. Next to him is Bruce Stewart-Brown. He's the senior vice president of food safety, quality, and live production at Perdue. Dr. Stewart-Brown is responsible for the health and care of 13 million Perdue chickens across family farms on 14 states. Marc Guiltinan is a professor of plant molecular biology and horticultural botany at Penn State University. His research explores the molecular basis of plant development and enhancing crop improvements. And on the end is Marc Oshima, who is the co-founder and with AeroFarms, which is a leading clean tech company that builds and operates indoor vertical farms around the world. So we're really glad to have these folks here. And I'll probably start off by having each panelist talk a little bit more in depth about what they're working on right now. And I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience, as well. So feel free to gather your questions, and we'll have folks walking around as well. So Marc, first off, I want to thank you for the greens at lunch. It was very nice of you to provide those.
That's good.
It tasted very good. And why don't you tell us a little bit more about AeroFarms?
Yeah, thank you, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's exciting to think about the future of food is something that we are very much focused on every single day and how we bring that to life. And so the work we're doing, when we talk about indoor vertical farming, we want to share with you a little bit of background on that technology and the work we're doing. It's fundamentally, though, not about urban farming or just even indoor farming. It's about agriculture overall. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing to transform ag and the communities that we serve. So just a little bit about the history of the company. We've been around since 2004, so we'll be the ones to tell you that this is incredibly complex. We started out in upstate New York. Our chief science officer, Dr. Ed Harwood, was a professor at Cornell University, one of the top ag programs. And so we've always had very much a science-driven approach in terms of the kind of farming that we're doing. So the Aero and AeroFarms refers to aeroponics, and so this is a misting the roots. It's a type of hydroponics, but it's one of the ways that we can deliver water much more efficiently. We think about what is our most precious resource. We talk about sustainable farming. 70% of fresh water is going to agriculture. 70% of the pollution is coming from agriculture in terms of overuse of fertilizers or pesticides. So if you want to have an impact, you think about what we can do from a farming standpoint. And so this is a way of growing with the aeroponics that uses 95% less water versus the field and even 40% less than hydroponics. But when we talk about indoor farming and the idea that these are beds stacked on top of each other, this is the idea that we can have the right kind of economies of scale. How do we enable that local production? How do we bring the farms to really the cities, to where the people are, and bypass a very complex supply chain? We've heard some of the themes earlier today around food waste in terms of, again, how much spoilage there is across the whole value chain. But by bringing the food here, this is really just-in-time growing, and we're working with a wide range of different partners. We work with major food service companies, major institutions, major supermarkets, and so this is the idea that, how do we feed the masses? Just to give you a little bit of sense in terms of really what's driving this in terms of the productivity. So as a company, we've grown over 700 different types of varieties. We focus on our commercial farms, and we're looking at what is our 9th farm. It's the world's largest indoor vertical farm based on output. This is focused on short stem leafy greens and herbs. And so our system And what makes AeroFarms very unique is that we've designed everything. We have the engineers in-house, we have the plant scientists in-house, we have registered dietitians in-house. We're thinking about the plant health, how it translates into human health, the whole process. But for baby leafy greens that may out in the field take 30 to 45 days to grow, we can grow in 12 to 14 days because we're giving the plant exactly what they need when they need it. And so this is really game-changing in thinking about year-round production. That means up to 30 harvests a year. And so all of a sudden, you're thinking about consistency, high quality, supply, and what we can do from that standpoint. So it's tremendous in terms of working with the selling partners, helping address their pain points they have around sourcing, availability, and shrink. Just to give you a little bit of sense of, what does a healthy root system look like? This is actually a romaine lettuce. We're actually looking at the health of the roots, and there's an incredible biome that's there. You can actually see droplets of water. So with the aeroponics and the misting, we can actually look at the micron and see the absorption of the water and as well as the nutrients. We think about plants don't need sunlight, they need spectrum of light. And so we're the only commercial farmer in the world that's been growing exclusively with LED light since 2009. Even the LED ray is a custom design. We have a chief technology officer formerly a chief technology officer of a publicly traded LED company, formerly of GE Lighting. So again, this idea of having this holistic approach has a huge impact both in terms of our CapEx and the equipment and the cost of the equipment, but also in the operating. It's understanding what do the plants actually need. And so we actually are able to deliver and have more effective photosynthesis, and again, consistently. So it's independent of seasons, independent of weather, and again, be able to deliver that kind of quality. It's also part of what we call our effective insect pest management program. So this is a way of growing with 0 pesticides. And so again, what is the consumer looking for at the end of the day? They are looking for a clean product. Our product is actually ready to eat, no washing is needed. And the idea that the consumer can really enjoy the flavors like you were mentioning at lunch today. So that idea that you don't have to wash off the essential oils or flavors or damage it in that very aggressive washing process. The idea that with the light system though, we eliminate parts of the green spectrum that the insects would use to navigate. We eliminate the infrared they would use for mating purposes. So even if an insect were able to get in, we make it very inhospitable. And that fast growing cycle that we talked about is actually faster than an insect maturation process. So there are things that we're doing from technology that allows us then to think about having a clean product. The idea that we're using technology though in a completely new way with machine vision, right? We're mapping, we're actually looking at and doing 3D modeling of the plant to understand the qualitative health. We're doing spectral imaging. The idea that, again, things the human eye can't even see or detect, we're then able to evaluate. And what that means is, we can then ensure, how and what that ruby streak mustard green is going to look like. And so a horticulture meeting for us really looks like a statistics meeting in terms of thinking about, again, how do we measure and those outputs. But we have high stakes, so making sure that ruby streak mustard green is going to show up when we work with top chefs and how it's going to be able to be enjoyed. The product that we have at retail is under our retail brand called Dream Greens. And just to give you a sense of some of the partners we're working with, it's not just the Whole Foods, but the ShopRites, which is a major mass market supermarket here. But things that we're doing, we're putting at the forefront, and people have commented on the flavor. So here with our baby arugula, perfectly peppery, the idea that we can actually celebrate that, we can accentuate that, we can identify the different stressors on the leafy greens to be able to optimize again for taste and even nutrition to have a very differentiated product. And what we're also celebrating is the idea that it's locally grown. So our farms, we're putting them in the communities, we're employing people from the communities, and so it's really by the community, for the community. So this is a little bit about who we are and what we're doing.
That's great. Great. Thanks, Marc.
Yeah.
Next, Marc.
Well, thank you also for inviting me here. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Here we go. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about a much larger plant. It's a tree, cacao, Theobroma cacao, the source of chocolate, and give you a little bit of background about what we do here at Penn State. As you heard, I'm a plant biologist at Penn State, and also we have Ciela Maximova on. She's my partner. Together we run a lab. We have about 12 people in our lab there, and we study genomics of cacao. But we're focused mainly on disease resistance because different kinds of diseases are really the major threat to the cacao farmers. They lose about 40% of their crop each year. So this is a small, think apple, like it's an apple tree. If you haven't seen a cacao tree, think about an apple. It's about the same size of a tree. It grows about the same speed. It takes a few years. You get these beautiful pods that grow on the main trunks of this tree. And inside is a very delicious fruity nectar that surrounds the seeds. If you ever get a chance to try that pulp that's around the seeds, you should do that. because you can't really buy that commercially. Although I think there's a couple companies starting to develop those products. And then this is a fermented product. The seeds are fermented and then dried, and here you see them drying. And then at the factories, they're roasted, and it's where you get the beautiful flavor development. Just a little bit about why this is important. Why do we do this at Penn State? It's a pretty multi-billion-dollar industry, and lots of jobs and lots of export for the U.S. economy. But also a lot of U.S. produced agricultural products go into the chocolate. So peanuts and sugars and almonds and other things that are included into that. So it's pretty important for the U.S. economy. And at Penn State, we've been doing research for over 50 years. I haven't been there 50 years, so this program started quite a long time ago. We study all kinds of different aspects, from the farmer's economy, the history of chocolate, all the way to manufacturing of chocolate, the technologies to make chocolate, and develop new products. So this is a big team of people. We have what we call the Cocoa and Chocolate Research Network. I think we have about 60 people at Penn State, all doing one thing or the other on this amazing product. In my lab, one of the main things we're interested in, again, is helping farmers and helping them to have better lives through higher yielding plants. And sustainability, how can cocoa farmers grow their plants more sustainable and have higher yields and so on. So we also do a lot of training of scientists. So we have students coming from Colombia, from Brazil, from all around the world, really, that come. And that's going to be the next generation of scientists, hopefully, to go back to their countries, to the producing countries around the world. Oops, it's going the wrong way. Just a couple of the things we do. So one is genomics. We've sequenced the cacao genome. There's about 28,000 genes. We're looking at a subset of those, about 2,000 that are involved with the defense response. We're trying to understand which are the most important genes, and that information could be used in breeding or new types of breeding. Genetic engineering. We are the only lab in the world that has created GMO transgenic cacao trees. They're only in the greenhouse. We have not put them in field sites. They're not directed at commercial production, but they're just for research purposes to understand gene functions. I was invited here because one of the parts of that project was we actually were the first lab, the only lab so far, that has used CRISPR to modify cacao. We also work on propagation of cacao and so on. So that's all for me.
Bruce?
Yeah, my name's Bruce Stewart-Brown. I'm a veterinarian at Perdue Farms in Salisbury, Maryland here. And the company is just about to celebrate its 100-year anniversary, all family-owned, fourth generation now, quite involved. And as Marc said, he hadn't been there all those 50 years. I haven't been there all these 100 years. But I have been there 21 and started as a field veterinarian and have done a lot of things in the past 20 years with the company. And if you're not familiar with the history of the company, you might not know. If you are familiar with the company, you'll know that the last 10 years has been quite a transition for us as a company paying attention to consumers and their expectation around chicken and other animal proteins. So we have this really intense listening component to our business, and I've been responsible for kind of assimilating some of those customer inputs in the last kind of 20 years, trying to figure out what consumers are worried about and what we can do about it. And if we want to stay in touch with chicken as it goes on, we got to address some things that people are worried about. I put together like three examples of that for you to kind of look at. And one of them is today the 13 million chickens a week that we produce are all raised no antibiotics ever. But that didn't happen like overnight. Actually, that's really the wrong way to do that, to decide, look, consumers are worried, let's pull all the antibiotics. That will end up being a bad thing. for chickens and for the chicken product. We started in 2002 on this project, kept it kind of secret, made it a project. We talked about it all the time, kind of steered through all the phases that needed to happen for us to be successful in taking antibiotics out. And really only started talking about it in 2014 and got it all done in 16. So really a long-term thing. And what it taught us in that whole deal is you got to change the way you raise chickens. You got to be cleaner, you got to pay attention to all the details, and that led us to another component of our evolution, which is changing the way we raise chickens, or committing to animal care. Really well cared for chickens don't need antibiotics, don't benefit from them. So it'd be a waste of money and effort and everything else to even use them. So change the way you raise chickens in such a way that you'd never use it even if it was kind of on the table. A third component of that, here's the other part of animal care that's kind of important is, I think Marc mentioned before, making sure that the plant gets what it needs. Well, we've been pretty good, actually, as an industry, paying attention to what a chicken needs. We've been really bad or really poor at figuring out what a chicken wants. And this part of animal care for us is make sure they get what they need, take care of them in absolutely the right way. And by the way, ask them periodically what they'd like. And if you can provide a housing experience for them to act like a chicken, let's do that. And that's a little bit different than most people's approach. The other part in the evolution of our company is to be wide open to people's input, even those people that might not like you or that are perhaps critical of you. If they're in it for the chicken, let's go ahead and proactively invite them in and talk to them, as well as the farmers. Get them in the room at the same time so everybody hears the perspective. Be respectful of each other. If you're not respectful, you don't get to come back. As long as you're here for the chicken and for the exchange of information and you respect each other, let's get everybody in the same room. And this is a little bit of a video then that shows this. I'll just try clicking, see if it works. So can somebody click the screen? Perhaps right in the middle of the screen.
There we go.
There you go.
We have 133 companies who have committed already, and Perdue has committed to providing chicken according to these standards, which I think is the most important first step and shows that it's possible.
We can conservatively, positively impact the lives of hundreds of millions of animals. That is an enormous opportunity. Not only an opportunity, but that I think is our collective responsibility.
As we looked at what our long-term kind of goal was with chicken and how we're growing chicken on our menu as a menu item, we had to decide which route we wanted to go, and finding companies, Perdue and others, that were willing to grow with the program and find long-term solutions.
We feel that way. We're okay with saying, look, we're going to do some things that are different and are better, and if the rest of the industry wants to kind of follow along, then we're okay with that happening as well.
Yeah, so there's animal advocacy groups, there's farmers in the audience, there are customers in the audience. We do some panels such as this to get some exchange in it, and it's every year. And here's maybe the lessons learned that you kind of see a transition for us as a company. In the antibiotic example I used, we didn't talk about it, we just worked and tried to figure out how to make this happen. Don't talk when you're 10% there or 30% there. Wait till you get it almost all buttoned up and then talk about it. Animal care is way different. We have decided we're going to say where we're going and not be there, not be all buttoned up, and let the public and others kind of know the direction so they can weigh in and be a part of it. And actually, I think if we were doing maybe even antibiotics today, we would do it this way, which is, look, come with us. Here's where we're headed, and we're not all there. And then this part about telling the story and asking for input, admitting when you're wrong, go fix the stuff that's broke, keep going, and get as many people involved. If their heart is in it, okay, well then let's talk. So that's our story, and that's how we have been kind of migrating here in the last 10 years or so.
Okay. Thank you. Jason.
Howdy, how's everybody? Awake, hopefully. Hey, my name is Jason Rowntree. I'm an associate professor of animal science, and this is my career in a nutshell right here, actually. So kind of it's always the crap hits the fan mentality. Actually, grew up on the Gulf Coast of Texas, and went through undergrad at A&M, a master's at Mississippi State, and a Ph.D. at Michigan State. I worked in beef cattle through my career, nutrition. Normal standard university trained mentality, right? Output over input, feed the world, do more with less, many of those mentalities. And so I graduated from Michigan State, had the opportunity to go to Louisiana State, and I was on faculty there for about 6 years. And so I started in 2003 and tried to replicate all these things that we were doing at universities. Wendell Berry said one time that, you know, he called land grants like airports. Once you've been to one, you've been to them all. And I think I shared part of that, doing a lot of things that I just saw and replicated. And then all of a sudden, what do you think this is after right here? Hurricane Katrina and Rita, right? So I didn't realize that, but working at LSU, I was also responsible for helping with food-based disasters. And so here I am trying to save the world with typical beef cattle science. And next thing you know, Liz, my friend from Louisiana, I met, there she is, yeah, from New Orleans. The crap hit the fan, right? And this was actually 14, 15 miles inland south of Lafayette, Louisiana after Hurricane Rita. And I was actually very involved with the relief and recovery efforts. And so the thing I learned really specifically is that, you know, I always had this glimpse of U.S. agriculture as this resilient beacon, and I think we do a lot of things right in U.S. agriculture. But what I learned about, though, is that you can go from a first world society to a third world country in minutes. And the other thing I really noticed in that process is that Louisiana is very diverse agriculturally, but it also just has quite a few commodity crops. There isn't a lot of real food there, like, say, what Marc's doing at the end, a localization. And so because of that experience, I really started thinking about my education differently. How do I do research differently? And I really tried to embrace, what does resilience look like in agriculture? And so about I guess 3 years after these storms, I had the opportunity to go back to one of my alma maters, Michigan State University. And I was also asked to oversee 2 research centers. I've got about 1,100 grazable acres across those 2 centers. I manage about 500 red Angus cow-calf pairs along with yearlings. And this is the new canvas that I get to work with. And so I inherited a very normal university farm. It was, again, output over input, lots of fertilizers, lots of machinery. And I just made the decision to quit all that stuff. And we quit fertilizing, we quit cutting hay. We made it an imperative to start grazing longer into the season, lower costs, be a demonstrative model for producers in our area. And so what I concurrently did is I started looking at research. I started measuring greenhouse gas emissions in beef cattle about 2010-11. And I also started measuring carbon in those systems as well. And so effectively what our research showed over time is that through proper management, we actually were able to not only see beef cattle improve land through building carbon, through improving water infiltration, but we were also finding that they were actually building more carbon in the soil than all the emissions that were being offset into the atmosphere. And that's something you typically don't see in the press. And how are we doing that? How can cattle actually do that? What I call adaptive multi-paddock grazing, I'm actually a real fan of holistic management. I've worked with Alan Savory, who was on the slide this morning, and been a scientific advisor working with them. But it's a premise of using livestock and grazing livestock similar to how wild migrating ruminants traverse through grassland landscapes before we fenced everything. And effectively what we're doing is we're putting cattle in tighter groups. We're trying to get a lot of animal impact on a piece of land, but then we're also moving those cattle off that land and allowing for adequate recovery. And what we find is when we do those things, we first of all see that we get more pounds of beef per unit land. We see more biodiversity because plants are getting longer to recover, so higher trophic cascade plants are allowed more opportunities to germinate. We found water is infiltrating considerably better in these systems. And as we began to monitor, we also saw the fact that by putting more above ground biomass and allowing for more recoveries, once we got off the fertilizers, actually our plants even responded better in these diverse perennial grasslands. That therefore meant that there's more biomass below ground, and that's the carbon you hear about and what happens in this natural ecological system. 70 to 80% of that carbon is actually tied to microbes and rhizobial carbon. So it's this symphony of microbes and bugs partying below ground that are actually building this massive amount of biomass below. And so the fact is that through this research, we've actually been able to show that cattle can be a very useful component to the ecosystem when managed properly. And so that's really a network in what we're doing today. So our work today is a few-fold. We're looking at different systems and how they are influencing enteric methane. How many have heard enteric methane in beef cattle is a real problem, right? And it's been happening for tens of thousands of years, ultimately. If it wasn't cattle, it was bison. If it wasn't bison, it might have been something else, right? So we look at that. Honestly, we typically find that IPCC equations overestimate methane by 20 to 30% in our models here in the United States. Doesn't mean it's necessarily globally. And so we also look a lot at grass finishing. I'm not for or against grass or grain. I'm agnostic. I just want to make any system better. But we have worked to really improve the productivity of that approach. And we normally sell about 100 to 200 grass-fed animals a year through that. Through adaptive multi-paddock grazing, we've lowered the time to kill based on existing literature by 30 to 40%. We've dramatically improved carcass weights in that process as well. And finally, we try to also develop localized value chains for the producers that we're engaging with.
That's awesome. Great detail. Thank you. There's a lot there. As you can tell, we've got 4 very different approaches and lenses of sustainable food production, academics and actual technology companies and a food company. Maybe we start with a baseline. Like, what is, sustainability can have many different definitions based upon where you're at. I'd be curious, like, what is your company or your lens or your research, what is your definition, Marc, Oshima? Maybe first, how do you define sustainability?
It very much is a complex consideration, and we think about it a whole ecosystem. So we're thinking very much beyond just, we're thinking about all the different stakeholders when we think about the sustainability. And so I think what's critical there is that we're thinking about the community, we're thinking about our workers, we're thinking about the community that we serve, as well as we talk about the environment, right? There's a reason we didn't mention, but we are a certified B Corporation, and that's really important because when we're looking at different certifications out there for traditional agriculture, we fundamentally didn't feel like organic went far enough, right? And so this idea that, again, how to grow with less water, how to grow with no pesticides, this is really important in terms of that scorecard. But also with the certified B Corporation, you're also not only looking at the environmental factors, you're looking at societal factors. So the idea that you're creating economic opportunities. We're creating year-round jobs, fair wages, benefits. It's changing that equation when we think about how business can be a force for good. And that's a really critical part of when we think about truly sustainability, everybody, all the actors have got to benefit.
Bruce, how about you? What is Perdue?
Yeah,
how
so
do you define
I would say, I'll give you 3 examples a little bit. I mentioned one, which is here are these animals that are under our care and that we're responsible for. How you going to feel? What's the right thing to do there? How should you migrate through this responsibility of caring for the animals in the right way and helping people understand how you're doing that, so that all that area of animal care and moving through some of the changes. I would say it like, I sometimes say it like if my grandma was here and I was explaining this to her, I'd want her to be proud of us as well as all the folks, all my kids and everybody else need to feel good about the food that they're consuming and how it was raised. So that's one. The second thing is to be responsible to the farmer. The farmer has invested in our case, we don't own the farms. We own the chickens and the feed that they're fed and the care management approach that we use. But the farmers own the facilities and they do the work. We have to be responsible to them for this investment that they've made. If we can help them get more out of that investment while taking care of all the things that we're doing. If we decide to put less chickens on the farm, then we need to pay them more per chicken. So we have to be responsible to them and the evolution of the system itself. The other thing that's really obvious in our case is when you come to our facility, and growing number of facilities we have, there's solar panels everywhere, and our energy, we're conscious of our energy consumption and how that evolves, so we are investing quite heavily in the idea of being responsible to our energy consumption and how we need to move through that. So there's 3 examples.
Good. Marc, how about you? How would you define it in your research for cacao?
Sure. Well, it's quite different for a plant like cacao that's grown in tropical region and mainly in developing countries. About 70% is in West Africa and Ivory Coast and Ghana. So, of course, we look at it from a holistic point of view, where we try to people, planet, profit, and try to address all that. I mean, the work that we specifically do has more with production and the farmer side, but we work with community developers, and that's a very big part of this. Is many of these are very impoverished communities building just community resources, simple things like availability to loans for farmers, and that kind of economic development and also community development. The productivity side, cacao over historically we've seen what we call migratory agriculture, where they basically burn out the soil and then move in deeper into the rainforest. And we're pretty much out of land. We will be out of the land. So that can't continue. That's not sustainable, obviously. We can't just keep moving to new land. We need to produce more on less land, but we need to do that in a sustainable way. A lot of those farmers can't afford lots of fertilizers and pesticides, so much of it's grown kind of organically. And there's some very simple things like teaching farmers how to prune a tree can almost double their yield, for some farmers. So in a developing country, it's quite different from these very high technology things. But then the third part, I think, is trying to link these farmers to the market, to the industry. And the industry has to be obviously profitable, but the industry needs to fairly share that profit, I think, back to the farmers. And that's another place, a lot of discussion about that. I mean, cocoa farmers really probably don't get what you would call a fair wage, I would say, in most countries. So there's kind of a disparity there. And that is, out of our hands. That's something that the industry needs to really deal with. The pricing structure for the cacao value chain is a little out of balance, I would say.
And how about you, Jason? You talked about regenerative ag. Sure. You talked about forage and pasture land and microbials, like obviously
all this good stuff, right?
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, to me, and this is something that I've gleaned working with others, is that when I think of this lens, I think that the key is simultaneously, and it's got to simultaneously improve social well-being, environmental regeneration, and profitability all at the same time. The reason I say the same time is because it's so often to use the 3 Ps, like planet, profit, people, and compartmentalize them and maximize profit and screw the other 2. And so I think it's important to always try to address them simultaneously, and I think it has to be in the short and long term. So it's really trying to address those 3 aspects in the short and long term. And what happens is, like today, farmers, I mean, they want to make good decisions, but the problem is that they're always tied into these short-term messes that often they didn't create. Whether it's policy, whether it's trade, whether it's these other things.
Weather.
And you get forced into making decisions that have short-term, it's kind of like peeing on yourself to get warm. I mean, it's warm for a little bit.
That's one way to put it.
Then it's really cold after that, right? And so it's kind of one of those. And I learned that from a friend. I stole that, but actually that's just the first thing that came to mind. But
That'll probably make it on air
That's
here,
the
yeah.
short term with long term negative ramifications. So I think those three things simultaneously short and long term.
In talking to our audience, farmers are nervous about sustainability because it's a fungible topic. I think you're right. I think they do want to do good things, but they're also a profitable business. So can farmers be sustainable and profitable? Can they do it? And Marc, I don't know, your business is built about building a brand new product, but
Yeah, it's a new way. I mean, so it's not at an expense, it's not an either or proposition, right? And so we're thinking that this every day in every decision we make in terms of our design, in terms of our operating, in terms of the plants. And then, how do we drive yield is really critical in terms of getting the right kind of returns. But it's again about providing that good stewardship and thinking again, it's not by any means at the expense of one another.
And how about you, Bruce? You talked about your conversations with farmers. They're critical. Can they do sustainable practices and still survive?
For us, it's a very exciting thing. We are interested to transform agriculture and transform to do something significant in the world of raising chickens or raising animals for protein. So when there presents an opportunity to differentiate yourself in a way and provide some innovation, that's a really good place for us, a really, really strong place in our wheelhouse. And to incorporate the farmer into it is absolutely necessary, because sometimes the best ideas come from them if you spend the time to explain the concept. Like sustainable as a word is a really tough word for people. It just means, it can mean a whole bunch of things. We just talked about like 20 different things that kind of fall under that umbrella. So to help farmers get maybe out of the jargon and into the idea and say, look, here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sure everybody stays whole, that we move this thing forward based on the new things we know, and the things that we've done for years and years and years. We need to change some of those. It's not, you're not bad, we're not bad people, or it's not, we're not kind of making let's stop making a judgment and let's talk about what we kind of where we can get to. I want you to think about it with me. I'd rather that happen than we make a law or we make a rule. After we'll get somewhere, we'll do that. But first, let's have this conversation in a general way, and you weigh in. You come, tell us what you think, and if they have some really good ideas, if you slow down for a sec, don't use a whole bunch of jargon and talk normal, I'd say, then kind of you can get somewhere, get some good ideas.
And it seems like if we're going to make progress in sustainable production, you've got to be able to measure things. You've got to be able to define what you're going to do, where you want to get to, and how do you measure it? How do you help the industry measure that progress, whether it's in soil health or nutrient reduction or different kinds of grazing? And how do you help farmers do that?
Yeah, one example that we're working on collectively, it's actually a global launch, but I've worked with for instance, the Savory Institute on one program. It's been adopted by General Mills and Applegate now, but it's called the Ecological Outcome Verification. And what we try to do is work with farmers and work on simple monitoring practices. For instance, this approach, we have 16 ecological indicators at the soil surface. We do soil health, and we do some soil cores for carbon. But we tie it to leading and lagging indicators because, certain things take a long time to measure, like soil carbon, for instance. And so what we're doing is establishing like really ideal farms in every ecoregion we can that have very high functioning ecosystem processes. And we score it, and then we work with farmers in that region and tie that score to other farms so farmers can see what they can accomplish. And we are doing that, and actually there's new labels like the Land to Market, for instance, that General Mills is using, and I believe Applegate is using something similar to where consumers have the opportunity to buy food from that farm and from a farm that's being ecologically verified for regenerating ecosystem processes, right? Patagonia has the regenerative organic claim and some others that are out there. But the key is like you can do all the remote sensing in the world. I mean, it's great technology, but at the end of the day, if you can't work with farmers on seeing those things changing, especially when you're in Kenya or in Central America or other places, if you can't show them and they can see what they're doing, you're really not going to see adoptive changes. And of course, again, I mean, it's got to be profitable, and they've got to see the production there as well.
Marc, your business was built around new technology and measurement of what every plant needs in its nutrients and monitoring pests. Like, technology's got to help you monitor on an hour-by-hour basis how they're doing.
Well, it's really 24/7. It's minute by minute. And so the idea is, without question, we have sensors integrated into the entire growing process from seed to package, and we're able to monitor what's happening, with the plants. And so each one of our growing towers, we really think of it as really kind of like a living computer. It's sensing, it's adapting, it's adjusting to the different varieties and different stages of maturation. And the big difference versus what Jason just talked about is we can actually course correct real time, right? The idea that we can adjust, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a biological system, so there are going to be some variances. How do we normalize that? How do we measure that? So every single harvest has millions of data points associated with that. And so then we're able to understand cause and effect and then be able to develop what we call a growing algorithm, looking at all the abiotic factors, the environmental factors, thinking about the genetics of the seed, thinking about all the key things we think about, like lighting or the nutrients, and then how to optimize that. So these give you a sense of size and scale. The year before versus the year before, we grew over 500 million plants. Just the sense of size and the impact. And think about then millions of data points associated with each one of those plants. It's just a really order of magnitude. This is really big data, but more importantly, how do we turn that into key insights? And so we think we're harvesting not just the plants, but really the insights in terms of, again, how to replicate and have the scale. One of the things that we did when we talked about our growing cycle, we went from 16 days down to 14 days. I mean, just to be able to have that continuous improvement as well means additional crops per year and additional output. So again, being able to measure, monitor, and then course correct are really critical components here.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bruce.
Just a really brief example of a metric that has taken us a long way in Perdue and in chickens, and that is to focus on the health of the chicken foot, the pad, the paw. Once we decided several years ago that the paw health was a very big thing to us, and that means that it's a perfect paw, no blemishes on it. When we started, maybe 70% of the chickens would be good and 30% in the winter would have a little blemish on their paw. Farmers understand paw health. It's easy to measure. You can go out and pick up 10 or 15 chickens and look at their paws and get a pretty good sense of the health of the paw. Well, there's an economic benefit to that because we do sell paws. Not many of you probably. We didn't have any for appetizers last night, but people do eat them, and they are an economic component. If you focus on paws, you have to dry out the chicken house. You have to have nice kind of dry litter. If you get dry litter, you produce less ammonia. That's a really good thing for air quality and the environment as well. If you focus on paw health, you will have dry litter. You will actually get a whole lot less bacteria in the chicken house. Better chicken health, better food safety pieces come with better paws. So a simple thing like, let's stay focused on paws. Okay, well, why would that be? Well, there's so many ways to win with good chicken paws.
Have you not learned something today? That's fascinating.
Yeah, paws are important.
They are.
Well, in cacao, its pods are important.
Yeah.
But, a little different for cacao, I would say, again, in the developing country. The farmers, they're very smart and ready to adopt if it's profitable. I mean, they're just not going to do change anything to try to save the planet. They got to feed their family, and they're barely able to do that. So, any kind of changes towards sustainability have to include, all that chain. And I think it goes, back to the industry really to help support that. So, part of it's farmer education. Very simple things, again, pruning, throwing a little fertilizer, much lower tech than these guys. Actually, we call it machete technology. The farmer, the main thing they use is a machete. That's pretty much their only tool and their only technology. But If it is profitable, they will do it, and they will learn it very fast, and all their neighbors will learn it. Within a few years, you can see it adopted.
Can I add to that? Yeah, I mean, I thought you made a great point because, I mean, one thing when you think about this sustainability piece and you look at all these reports that come out, they're always global mandates often, like, will we find agriculture to be emitting this much? And it's important, I think, to not let those numbers, basically the average means very little at a local scale. For instance, agriculture globally might be 20% of emissions globally, but in the United States, they're only 9%. And every local context has different challenges, whether it be socially, environmentally, economically. And I think when we have these debates on how to feed ourselves and how to do it sustainably, we need to be very mindful of the local context. And just, the things about, well, we just need to get rid of half the cattle and, problem solved and we'll move on. But then, you've got a billion people globally that directly depend on cattle, for instance, for their lifestyle. And just thinking about the challenges you have, it's really important to keep these things very local in terms of defining what long-term is sustainable for a system.
It seems like the communication to the consumer about what you're doing and your goals is really important. So whether or not you're implementing new technology and what its impact is, how you're listening, and how you're implementing new technology. Marc, you talked about CRISPR as an example. Like, how do we talk to the consumer that what CRISPR is, and does it have benefits? Are there costs? What's the trade-offs? Why are you doing that? I mean, you don't connect to consumers perhaps, but like, what lessons are you looking at saying, CRISPR, let's not make the same mistake we did with GMOs, for example, or other technology implemented in agriculture that the consumer wasn't clear at all about what the benefits were.
Right. So when we try to talk to consumers or just non-scientists about the technology, it's just complicated and nerdy enough to make it really difficult for people to actually understand what it is. What is a DNA sequence? What is a change in a DNA sequence, and how does that affect my food? It's pretty hard for a lot of people to understand it. So we do, we use examples of natural breeding and try to compare it to that to make people understand that it's a form of breeding. It's a technology that can accelerate breeding, make it faster, but it's like a natural process that they know about somewhat. And yeah, then if the questions come, then we dive in a little deeper into the technology if people want to know how it works. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's really a difficult problem. And actually, the biggest problem with this is normally when we go to talk about GMOs or CRISPRs and these sorts of things, we're preaching to the choir. Like probably, well, I shouldn't say everyone here, but a lot of you know what it is. If you read the magazine, there's a nice description in there, and you probably okay. Most of you probably okay. Well, how many people here are okay with CRISPR? Let's see. Let's just take an informal. So I don't know, maybe that's about 50 or 70% or something. That's generally true. But if I went to, say, a Greenpeace meeting and gave this talk, maybe nobody would put their hand up. So it's hard to get our message outside of the choir, is what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the biggest challenge we have now. We've learned how to communicate it, but now to get it to the people that really need it.
Bruce,
so I was excited to see that article in the magazine.
Yeah, it's great to see it in EatingWell, very well covered, and hopefully more popular press will do that.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of that.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to watch companies as it relates to technology. One of the first things you got to decide is if you want to involve the consumer in this discussion, and if would you like to just go, let's say, off to the side and do stuff that you perceive to be really good and hope they don't ask too many questions about it? If you sit in that bucket, you're probably in trouble. I would say you're in trouble because you say the way to go forward with technology, you have a responsibility, and in our case, it's absolutely necessary to tell that story and allow the consumer to come with you. And to hear the faster you hear their questions, the more you can refine your story. I can guarantee you the first time you try to tell the story about automated catching, that you will not do it the best possible way. It won't be, but if you start saying, look, I'm going to tell this story. I'm going to help people understand how we catch chickens. First of all, that's a big step right there for you to decide you're going to tell stories. You're going to tell the stories in the best possible way, and if you get feedback that you're not doing that, you're going to change. You're going to figure out a better way to tell the story and be committed to it. It takes some time, and it takes some energy, and you got to listen to people. We can use a lot of fancy words, and kind of that helps you talk sometimes really quickly in a scientific venue, but you should stop. You should stop it if you can't kind of talk to your kids about it and have them not glaze over. You need to go again, and that's a really big commitment for companies.
So Marc, I'm curious, obviously you believe vertical farming can serve a lot of people. Some people think it's like, is it a niche, or can it become a mass supplier?
Yeah, there are a few things with that question, and so we think about areas we can have key impact, and there's certainly crops, but we think it's part of a broader solution. And so at the end of the day, we're hoping to serve as inspiration about how to do more with less and how to be able to set more standards. One thing we didn't talk about around sustainability, ultimately, though, is another key component is around the food safety. Bruce, you touched upon that a little bit, but the idea is, headline news, every single week we have a food recall. And so we think about, again, food security, food sovereignty. This is such a critical component. And so one of the things we're doing with indoor vertical farming is able to trace and track, right down to the square inch about what's going into that product and be able to ensure the integrity of that. And so I think that's really important when we think about the broader equation, like what can we do from best practices and be able to share. We're part of the FDA Romaine Advisory Task Force. We've actually just formed an industry, what's called the CEA, Controlled Environment Agriculture Food Safety Coalition. These are really important steps to really be able to help the broader community. And so our focus ultimately is about the impact we can have in the broader agriculture community.
And you think that indoor can serve a lot of people, though?
Absolutely.
In the greens or beyond?
Yeah. And so really the food that people eat, right? I mean, that's the critical thing that we think we can have a real key impact on. And we didn't talk a little bit about this. The food that we're growing, because we're managing and monitoring it, we can actually enhance the nutrition density. So when we talk about, again, how do you really feed the masses? You change that value proposition. So what are people actually getting? So we can actually change, a calorie is not a calorie, and really think very differently about that kind of investment. So huge opportunities to have impact on a couple different areas there.
Well, you bring up nutrient density, and we talked about flavor earlier. Like, I'm curious, how do we make plants and animal proteins more nutritious to eat and sustainable? How about you, Jason?
Oh, thanks. So I guess for me, like the thing that I didn't learn, I mean, I damn near flunked out of school, okay? But I made it, but I didn't realize that the soil was teeming with life from a microbiological perspective. And that typically, from a standpoint of nutrient transfer, that the microbes do such an amazing amount of bringing those. They actually are climbing into the roots of the plants and dropping off micronutrients, right? And so the things to me what I do know is that typically the greater the soil health, the greater the microbial respiration is typically tied to more biodiversity, which we all want, right? And we can do biodiversity in agriculture settings, we can do it in wildlife settings. And so and what our work would suggest also, I think, is that if you can increase the amount of secondary compounds, polyphenols, whatever, and get these greater, more biodiverse swards, I think you'll get more diversity below ground. You get more micronutrients being brought back into the tissues of the plants and animals. And I think ultimately, by doing so, we can do it with less inputs as well.
Yeah. Marc, how about you? You're a researcher. Go ahead, Marc.
Well, you go ahead first.
Okay. Yeah, I'm in cacao. One of the things we are interested in are polyphenols and also the cocoa butter, which is triglycerides, and maybe breeding plants that would have different types of molecules that would promote health for humans. But we also are looking at the flip side of that. So more is not always better, and we've learned that in cacao through cadmium. Cadmium is a heavy metal and it accumulates in cacao. And it's not good for you. It causes all kinds of medical issues. So we're actually in a project to map cadmium in soils to learn how to mitigate cadmium uptake by plants and to breed for plants that would take up less. And then like to give that technology and the knowledge to farmers so that they could, grow plants that are healthier in terms of less of an element inside the product. So it goes both ways.
Yeah.
I was just going to add that we actually are working with the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. We have a $2 million initiative that was awarded specifically around our ability to identify stressors for leafy greens and how to optimize for taste and nutrition. And we're partnering, again, also with some land-grant universities, helping them think about what's needed for next-gen curriculum. But we're working with Cornell University, Rutgers University, specifically on looking at the organoleptic properties and the satiety as well. And so ultimately, we can make huge advances, and actually our product is more nutritionally dense when we do third-party testing, over 100% more vitamin A or vitamin C. But you really want to change behavior, you make it taste good, right? And so James at lunch just shared with me, he had 2 helpings. Like, that's the biggest impact you can have in terms of like how you're going to be able to change behavior and have a bigger impact around nutrition. And so that's what we're really excited about when we're doing things around the flavor and getting people to enjoy it.
I know there's a lot of people in agriculture cite the fact that we've got to feed 2 billion more people here in a short amount of time. So there's this urgency to change practices and get more sustainable, and yet we're going to have a lot more mouths to feed and need a lot more food to feed those people. So I guess, Bruce, I'll start with you. It's like, in this clock to get to 9 billion or 9.5 billion, can you be sustainable and still get there?
Yeah, but I think it takes innovation, and it takes, for us, it's 3 things that we're focused on: breed, feed, and management style. And all 3 of them need to evolve. And in the process of going towards efficiency, and let's say in the United States, really heavy consumption of breast meat, right? Although maybe changing a little bit towards thighs and dark meat. But having said that, the chicken industry grew up through a strong consumer preference for breast meat, which led to breeding practices that generated a huge amount of breast meat. And the thing to be careful of is you really get after a particular trait, that trait might be more in volume but less in quality. So that's not interesting to us, or that's something we're interested to maintain the quality of the meat as well as make progress in all those other things. So that's a little bit different. Not all meat's the same. We don't believe that. There's good chicken and not so good chicken. Some of our best chicken comes from our organic production, and if you said breed, feed, and management style, well, the breed's the same generally. The feed is different in that there is no synthetic amino acids, but we manage for that. There might be a tool in there somewhere. And having said that, the management style is fantastically different. So for us, evolving our management style towards organic husbandry is a little bit of you see it coming in our. So yes, push for efficiency and all that, but don't leave product quality behind in the process.
How about you, Jason? I mean, beef consumption is up, but
It's actually fallen over time.
oh, has it?
Yeah, it's actually fallen over time. I was thinking obesity's gone up, beef consumption's gone down, but poultry consumption's gone up. I'm sorry.
Consumption of other things might have gone up as well.
I agree. Causation and correlation are bad science, right? And unfortunately, a lot of our human nutrition's on that. But the point being is that, look, we've got enough food to feed 10 billion people today, and we waste it. And we have a lack of refrigeration. And the other point is that where the population's growing, Nairobi, the Asia, other areas, I mean, the challenges are going to be more local, and often they don't have adequate refrigeration, adequate infrastructure. And so I think that sometimes when I hear like feed the world, I think like sell more stuff. And I think that it's got to be balanced to really identify what are the log jams. And often I think we already have the food today, and we have most of the tools in our toolbox to do it do it. And I think that we can do it in a way that hopefully won't denigrate Earth in the process. So.
I don't know, Marc, if you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't know chickens and cacao were so much alike, but I really liked what you said, and it applies perfectly for cacao, is breed, feed, and manage. You know, if we can do that, we can be sustainable. People think, well, chocolate, it's sort of a luxury thing, but can you imagine a world without chocolate? So we have to have chocolate, right? So we need to have more chocolate. So I think it's exactly parallel
Or
to
chicken.
this. Yeah, breeding better plants, breeding for the right traits, teaching people how to manage their plants. But then there's this value chain part, but go back to the companies that need to give feedback to the farmer a fair value for their hard work.
Well, we have been in this position before. We've had to feed 2 billion more people, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And so somehow now you could still argue that, there's still a lot of unfed people in the world, that there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of governments that are messing things up, but, hopefully there's hope anyway. I'd like to have hope that, we're going to be able to feed those folks. So we're going to take some questions from the audience shortly, so there'll be some people walking around with microphones. So if you have some, find them. But one last question I was going to ask you, and maybe Marc, I'll start with you and for each of you. Like, what are you most excited about in the future of food and the innovation that's happening?
It's really this marriage when we talk about technology, we talk about food. It's really thinking differently about our food and how we can enhance both nutrition and flavor, and have the ability to measure that and monitor it, and then think about the impact it can have across not only other categories of food, but anything plant-based, and the idea that we can have an impact in a wide range of different areas. So it's really exciting time ahead of us.
Marc, how about
Yeah,
you?
for me, the advances in genomics and DNA sequencing have really revolutionized over the past, really even just a couple of years. So our humans' ability to study genomes and understand them and get useful information out is just gone logarithmic. And we're seeing this in agriculture, but also in human medicine. And I think also the ability to use CRISPR or other more advanced tools of breeding is going to result in a very rapid acceleration of breeding of new varieties with very specific traits. And so, what you're going to see coming very soon, and you saw the tomato, they're going to be, the turnover of new varieties in grocery stores is going to accelerate. And so, well, for one, I look forward to all those interesting new plants and flavors and food experiences. But also, I think that's going to contribute a lot to sustainability. We need all the tools we have. We can't afford to throw out some of the most powerful tools we have, which are things like GMOs, CRISPR, and other new breeding technologies.
Bruce, how about you?
Just generally, the opportunities in innovation, the opportunities to explain or tell the story on innovation and the things you're trying, the new stuff you're doing, to be able to tell that and then to get such feedback, almost immediate feedback on it is such, unprecedented, how cool that process is these days. So you can have some new ideas, you can explain them really well, and then you can see how consumers respond to it in such a fantastically quick way today. It means that if you're into evolving, you can do some things in the next 10 years you couldn't do maybe 20 years ago. So.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to work with some amazing, brave farmers and ranchers that have opted to do things differently. They've looked at how ag has been, and they have dramatically lowered their inputs. They've improved their soil health. They're producing as much or more food than what they were doing. And we have the tools in our toolbox to do that today. And the beauty is the things that these farmers can do can be scaled. It's not just for a small farm. It can be done at scale. And so looking at ways that we can improve our food system, it's already being modeled. It's just a function of the pieces falling in place to see these actions used on a global context.
Great. Okay, happy to take some questions from folks. Yeah, Allie?
Hey, Marc, Oshima. The photo that you showed of the red lettuce was really striking, how clean the roots looked. Are any of your leafy vegetable roots palatable? And could you package and sell those as a finished product?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we definitely have the philosophy of root to leaf about how we can work. And what's exciting is that we've done testing on the, and you mentioned issues around cadmium. A lot of field-grown products have issues with heavy metals, particularly the brassicas as well. So we've really bypassed that, and so there's definitely flavor profiles there. We've been working with companies on the nutritional supplement side to be able to test and evaluate some opportunities there. There are things that we actually are doing with a second cut as well that normally be left in the field, and we're selling stems. And it's about changing behavior and thinking about acceptance around that as well. So exciting opportunities to be able to think about, again, from a business standpoint, how to monetize that, but then also just from a sustainability and environmental standpoint about how to eliminate waste. It's very much part of the circular economy. It's what our philosophy is.
Good.
Hello. Hi, my name is Rachel Landau. I'm a student at NYU, a graduate student. And my question is, the average age of the farmer is, I think, over 60 years old, right, in the U.S. And I'm curious why you think that is and how we might attract more young people into farming and how that might affect our ability to produce food sustainably going forward.
Well, I can answer part of that. I might be happy to have any of you jump in because we do a lot of research on farmers. And today, based on the 2017 Ag Census, the average age is about 59 years old. Why is that? Someone told me recently that the greatest technology ever invented for farmers isn't precision agriculture or self-driving tractors, it's artificial hips. Because farmers can farm a long time now, and they do. And our readers, we've got 60, 70-year-old readers because they've farmed typically for 40 seasons or more. I think the difficulty is farmers are really conservative and they're very isolated, and so they tend to raise their hand when they need to start talking about transitioning the farm when something happens. When dad dies or somebody gets hurt, then they start thinking about how do you transition the farm. So I think there's this tidal wave of land that's going to shift in the next 20 years. There's so much land owned by non-landowners, so it's a real issue. And I think we've got to somehow encourage families to talk about transitioning the farm to the next generation sooner, before they get sick, before they can't farm anymore, or whatever the reason. So I think there's a lot of initiatives, both nationally and statewide, to try and encourage people to get back to the farm. But in this era of low-price commodities, it's got to be really innovative ways. Let a son or daughter come back and start cattle, as an example, or start a high-value crop on the other part of the farm, just as a way to get started with their own thing and get the young generation started in some way attached to ag before they can take over.
I have just a really short one. I think that for us, actually, as you heard some of our direction there, there were some older farmers or some kind of really, I've been raising chickens a long time, I'm not interested in where you're going. I don't believe I've been wrong about the antibiotic piece. I'm not interested in what a chicken wants. That's not my deal. I don't want to do it. And then on the other side, younger people go, hey, wait a second, I was kind of thinking about this as a career. Now, if I'm going to raise somebody's chickens, I want to raise yours. I want to do that. So from our perspective, directionally, there's been a little bit of a shift, kind of both ways, honestly. Some folks that have been raising chickens a long time don't want to do that. And then on the other side is some real enthusiasm from younger folks that had a perspective on raising chickens that now, if we're going to do that part, I'm in. I want to do that if that's where you're going. So that has been a help to us as it relates to younger folks.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So imagine, if you can, that I'm the president of the United States. And for the longest time, we've been subsidizing different types of agricultural products. How do we need to change our policy? What would you advise me on how we need to change in order to support the kind of innovation that each one of you have actually been talking about here today?
So I'm a firm believer that in order to see change in the food system, it's got to come through private entity first. I think McDonald's, for instance, when they said, "Hey, we don't want gestation crates, we don't want battery cages in our production systems anymore," the industry switched overnight. And I think as industries become more aware of their challenges in their supply chain with climate and other aspects, my hope is that they're first of all are going to be the ones that say, we want to see farming practices implemented like this. And then I think over time, my hope would be is then that the policymakers are seeing that shift, and then they'll finally have to do something, okay? And so to me, I think that's hopefully the way that it goes. So then we begin to incentivize practices that are improving society versus those that are creating the dead zone.
I'm with Jason. The consumer will take it somewhere so fast. If it's a compelling thing to consumers and they value it and it's something that they turn the market, it will go way faster than any kind of piece of legislation and kind of forcing things to go. So think through a really good thing, tell the story, and if it's compelling to consumers, it can be amazing how fast. If you watched how fast no antibiotics went in the chicken world, it was staggering as it related to, and actually some of that worried me, because if you hadn't been working on it a long time, I would prefer that you took a little bit of time to fix some things before you kind of pulled antibiotics. But anyhow, the consumer, compelling things to consumers will make stuff go fast.
That's also been our message at the magazine, to tell farmers, like we did an issue called Meet Your New Boss, and it was like the consumer pushing her cart down the aisle with her children is really who's going to dictate your future. So pay attention to the consumer, look at American eating habits, and veer toward that, and you'll have a better shot at growing your operation. So.
And I would make somewhat of self-serving pitch to the president, Mrs. President over there. Do your homework. Look at the return on investment in agricultural research. It's massive. It's pays. I don't know the exact number, but it's like 100 to 1 or something. I think it's more than that over time. And historically, agricultural research is underfunded in the United States. Not only that, but now we want to do these systems approaches. We want to do real, true sustainability from soil all the way to human health. Those are very large integrative projects, and we really don't have very much going on in this, where we need to go. So let's invest more money in agricultural research.
I have a couple over here.
So I have a question about agriculture and the problem with just using one kind of seed and the loss of diversity that we have. So I know we've been talking about CRISPR and all these other things, which I don't have a problem with that as a method or anything like that. But how can people be convinced that growing a diverse number of things is something valuable, so that we aren't losing a lot of early seeds that were good tasting seeds, but perhaps are not things that are grown anymore for one reason or another? And I worry that people all grow the same seed and that'll be all that there is, and then there'll be some horrible pest that will come and totally destroy it. And that's happened before.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll just talk a little bit about, for leafy greens, if you look at the seed bank from 100 years ago, there were 497 different types of lettuces. And of those remaining today, it's less than 40. So that biodiversity talk about, those options have disappeared. And why? Because that field farmer is looking at key traits that allows them to survive today. So is it mildew resistant? Is it drought resistant? Can it withstand a very complex supply chain? And so we've talked a little bit about the idea that flavor has become tertiary or even non-existent in that equation. It's about making sure that they can get the yield and the crop return. So the work we're doing at AeroFarms, and we say we've grown over 700 different types of plants. The idea is to celebrate a rich options and bring back those heirloom varieties and be able to think about geography and cultural differences as well, so that you can really think about celebrating a rich biodiversity from that standpoint. So it's a great point.
Yeah, I would add a lot of those varieties, like the heirloom varieties or whatever, fell out of favor for their agronomic qualities, which weren't as good as some of the newer varieties. But yeah, I think, again, going back to investing in research, now we have the capability to breed, favorable traits into those kind of heirloom varieties and create that. So, all breeders and really most farmers are well aware that they don't want to get stuck in a monoculture, that we need diversity. And so there's sort of a sea change in plant breeding right now going towards to address that point. Let's say that. And I think we've now have some really amazing tools to be able to do it efficiently.
I think we got time. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, one new example on the beef side is Audubon actually has a bird-friendly beef protocol to improve, so many grassland birds are being lost because of the plowing of the Great Plains. And so they actually have bird-friendly habitat stamps, and they actually have their own beef label now. A blue nest beef, for instance, that is working towards those. And I think we'll see more of those types of aspects that incentivize diversity to help improve the loss that was said, on the mic there.
Yeah. I think we got time for one more.
Hello.
I don't know where the microphone is.
Hi. My name is Jessica, and I work for B&G Foods, a large CPG. And oftentimes we see in our research that if it says non-GMO, it's healthier. I know, Marc, you spoke to this a bit, but what are your thoughts on this, and how can companies or brands kind of guide this conversation with consumers?
Which Marc? This Marc?
That's a really tough one. There's a stack of scientific literature this high that will show you that it is all GMOs that have been commercialized are perfectly safe. Trillions of meals, not a single, evidence of any human health damage to any GMO meals. But you put this literature in front of consumers and their eyes glaze over immediately. And you go on the internet and you see what's happening in the hall of mirrors of false claims and outright lies that are out there in the social media. So it's a really difficult thing. There's a number of, basically it boils down to scientists need to learn how to communicate better with and spend some of their time to do this. Especially people like myself coming from a land-grant university, we have excuse me, less conflict of interest, maybe a more trustworthy source of information. But again, we run into this problem of we're preaching to the choir often. And we need to get to the other people. So one approach to doing that we're exploring is to use behaviorally targeted messaging through social media to try to get to those people who maybe are on the fence about GMOs. So partly it's how you communicate it, and partly it's who you're communicating that to. In the United States, we have a pretty good adoption. You want to see big problems, go to Europe and parts of Africa, and that's a much, much bigger problem.
I was just going to say, a genetically modified organism to me is an action. Using that technology is an action. It can be used for good outcomes, or it can be used for not so good outcomes. And we tend to think of the GMO in of itself as the outcome. But there are opportunities to use those technologies to do really good things. It can also be used to sell more stuff. And I think that's the thing that long term we just need to look at a GMO as a tool in the toolbox and really be more identifying on how they're being used versus the technology in of itself.
Well, thank you all. And by all means, let's give our panelists a round of applause for their time. And I wanted to welcome Sean Dreisbach, who's the nutrition and features editor of EatingWell, to the stage and introduce our next group.